Where do the 2024 Philadelphia Eagles rank all time compared to other Super Bowl winners of the past? We'll get into that on this Thursday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. I'm your host, Louie. The 2024 Philadelphia Eagles are Super Bowl champions. I think I'm going to start every single show for the next month by saying those words because it still does not feel real. This was one of the most dominant teams in NFL history. By far, I think the best team in franchise history. The only ones that are close, 2022, 2017, but this team takes the cake. They had an elite quarterback playing elite football in the biggest moments in the NFC title and the Super Bowl. This team had one of the best offensive lines of all time, one of the best skill position groups in NFL history, the youngest defense in the league that was number one in football and made a top 2 player of all time have one of the worst games, if not the worst game of his career. Like, it's a historically great team. I'm going to go as far to say I do think the Eagles in 2024, this version of the Birds, was a top 5 all-time Super Bowl winner. Like, when I go back and read some of the stats from this season, from the playoff run, from the Super Bowl, it's unbelievable what they accomplished to get a Super Bowl. This, again, as I said on the show yesterday, winning a ring in a vacuum always feels great. But for them to do it in the way they did, in dominant fashion, against good teams, like when you actually draw up what was the least ideal path for the Eagles in the playoffs, especially when it comes to like playing opposing quarterbacks, I think this was the least ideal path that they could have possibly had to play Jordan Love, then Matt Stafford, then Jaden Daniels, then Patrick Mahomes. That is not an easy path. That's one of the greatest rookie quarterback seasons of all time. I think the best in Jaden Daniels. Patrick Mahomes, again, is a top 2 player in NFL history. Matt Stafford is a Super Bowl MVP of the last 5 years. To me, the second best quarterback in the NFC, one of the most underrated quarterbacks of this era. Jordan Love is an up-and-coming young quarterback that nearly made it to the NFC Championship last year. For the Eagles to dominate, not just win a Super Bowl, but to have one of the most dominant championship runs, considering that being the path, it's unreal. Their 95 combined points in the NFC title and the Super Bowl is the most all-time for back-to-back title games that a team has ever had. They actually scored the most points in a single playoff in league history. They scored 145 points in those 4 playoff games this year. Like I said, they gave Patrick Mahomes, I think, the only player that's better than him all time, and he's not even 30 yet, so he could eventually be number 1. But Tom Brady is the only guy I would put ahead of Patrick Mahomes. They gave Mahomes the worst game of his career on the biggest stage, where Mahomes had a chance to do something that nobody, even Tom Brady, had never done, win 3 Super Bowls in a row. They had the most wins of all time in a season. They had the most rushing yards ever in a season. They have the second best playoff turnover margin ever, the fifth best playoff point differential ever, the 6th most points in a season. I mean, like I said, it's an all-time great skill position group. How many offenses all-time would you take over the 2024 Eagles? Maybe none. If there's any, it's only a few. One of the best offensive lines ever, an all-time great young defense, and just overall defense, a great coaching staff. To me, a top 5 general manager in NFL history in Howie Roseman. Yeah, I think it's safe to say that the Philadelphia Eagles of 2024 is a top 5 all-time Super Bowl winner. And I think even the teams that didn't win a Super Bowl, like if you want to talk about the 16-0 New England Patriots of 2007, you can make the argument the Eagles are better than that team too, and this team got it done. Like, I think they're a top 5, not just Super Bowl winner of all time, but a top 5 all-time team. I've just never seen a team like this perfect. Yeah, were there ups and downs of the season? Sure. Early on in the year, I think the passing game was the one thing that was kind of up and down, but when it mattered most, they had 2 of the most efficient passing games the NFL's ever seen in the playoffs, against Washington and against Kansas City. Jalen Hurts' game in 2024 in the Super Bowl, in the biggest game, was by EPA metrics the most efficient Super Bowl that a quarterback has had in the 21st century. So when it comes to like who can even compare, and every titled team was great, right? There were no flukes. There's no flukes in the NFL that win Super Bowls. I don't believe that, right? Even the teams like the Eagles in 2017 that had a backup and Nick Foles winning it, that was no fluke of a team. They were a juggernaut the entire year. When it comes to like, at least, so I'm going to only talk about teams that I personally watched. It would be very hard for me to argue why the 2024 Eagles are better or worse than the 1970s Steel Curtain Pittsburgh Steelers. So in the 21st century, who could I say would hang with the 2024 Eagles? There's only really 3 teams that come to mind from a dominant perspective across the roster. Like, yeah, any team with Pat Mahomes can hang. Any team with Tom Brady, like any of those Patriots teams, could probably hang. But who are the other most dominant Super Bowl winners that are up there with the 24 Eagles? I'd say there's 3 teams. The 2020 Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who are the other team that handed Patrick Mahomes one of the worst losses of his career, blowing him out in a Super Bowl. The 2013 Seattle Seahawks, who did the same thing to Peyton Manning and the Denver Broncos, who were an offensive juggernaut in 2013. And then I'd say from a roster perspective, the 2021 Rams, right, that had Matt Stafford, Cooper Kupp. You know, they had on defense Odell Beckham. On defense, they had Jalen Ramsey and Von Miller and Aaron Donald and Bobby Wagner, I believe, was on that team. Like, it was a dominant team. The F them picks, LA Rams. Like, they went all in on that strategy and won them a championship. The 2020 Tampa Bay Buccaneers had Tom Brady, Rob Gronkowski, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin. I mean, Leonard Fournette at running back was really good. You look at their offensive line. It was great. Tristan Wirfs, one of the best left tackles in football. You look at the defense. They had such a good pass rush. They had corners. They had safeties. Levante David and Devin White. Eagles great. Devin White, I wonder if he'll get a ring, right? It was a dominant defense. And they made Patrick Mahomes run for his life as much as the Eagles did in Super Bowl 59. The Seahawks, Russell Wilson, Percy Harvin, Golden Tate, Doug Baldwin, Marshawn Lynch, the Legion of Boom, Cliff Averill up front, Bobby Wagner, Malcolm Smith at linebacker was a Super Bowl MVP. I mean, that team was dominant too. I would say those are the 3 teams that are up there with the 2024 Eagles. It's them, it's the Birds, it's the 2020 Bucks, it's the 2013 Seahawks, and it's the 2021 Rams. Of those teams, I would take Philly over all of them. The only one that I would say is close, and maybe you could make the argument they're ahead, the 2020 Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I think it's the only team that would have a good case to be number 1 in the 21st century. I just think this team was so special, so perfect, pretty much, from top to bottom. That's why I said on yesterday's show, like, it is not a blueprint for the NFL, like how to build a Super Bowl team. You look at the Eagles, and it's like, well, how are we supposed to realistically emulate what they did? You should strive for that. You do need alphas and stars across the board to take down the all-time great dynasties that have historically great quarterbacks like Pat Mahomes or Tom Brady and coaches like Andy Reid and Bill Belichick. Like, you got to have dogs. You can't just have one. It can't just be like, for instance, Buffalo, just Josh Allen. You got to have not only Jalen Hurts, but also A.J. Brown, but also Saquon Barkley, and also Jalen Carter. Like, you have to have that kind of team. But I don't think it's realistic for the NFL to say we can do what Philly did in 2024. There's only a few teams this century on paper that were able to pull off what Philly did. Again, I'd say it's the 2013 Seahawks, the 2020 Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and the 2021 LA Rams. And I don't want to sit here and say on the pod this Eagles team is the greatest in NFL history, but it's up there. It's a top 5 team of all time. And in this century, the only one that I'd say has a good case against them is the 2020 Bucks. That's how special this team was. I mean, you heard those numbers. Unbelievable. The most points in playoff history in a single playoff run with 145. 95 combined points in the NFC title in the Super Bowl. Patrick Mahomes had the worst game of his career against this team. The most wins in a season. The most rushing yards ever in a season. The second best playoff turnover margin ever. It's an all-time great team. And the fact that it was in Philadelphia and they got it done and won a championship, that's what bothered me so much about 2022. That team will not have their rightful place in history as what I thought was before this team, the most talented, best team in Eagles history, even over 2017. And because they couldn't get it done, a lot of the times those teams go under the radar and get forgotten in history because you got to get it done. The 16-0 Patriots forever will not be put in their rightful place in history because they lost to the New York Giants. And the fact that this Eagles team got it done and avenged what happened in 2022, again, any Super Bowl feels good, but for that reason, for them to be now in history as one of the best teams of all time, beating a team that could have three-peated, it's sweeter. It feels so much sweeter. I want to tell you guys what my favorite underrated story of the 2024 Philadelphia Eagle is. I'm going to get into that coming up next, right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Eagles is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. As a small business owner, your work doesn't end when the clock hits 5. Your business is always on your mind, which means when it's time to hire, you need a partner that works just as hard as you do. That's where LinkedIn Jobs comes in. When you clock out, LinkedIn clocks in. LinkedIn makes it easy to post your job for free, share it with your network, and get qualified candidates all in one place. Post Your Job, LinkedIn's new feature, can help you write job descriptions and then quickly get your job in front of the right people with deep candidate insights. Here's a pro tip. Add the hiring frame to your profile picture to double your reach to qualified candidates. No wonder 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn, they help them find quality hires. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions do apply. Thanks as always for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. The Philadelphia Eagles are Super Bowl champions, and there are so many amazing storylines that you can get into about how this team is an all-time great team in NFL history, how they stopped the three-peat of Kansas City, how Jalen Hurts finally had his moment, overcoming the odds, overcoming all the scrutiny and the criticism, how Saquon Barkley had the most rushing yards of all time in a single season when you combine the regular season and the playoffs. The storylines of how Howie Roseman built this team, of how underrated Nick Sirianni has been and how he was counted out and wanted gone after the bye week, and now he's a Super Bowl champion. How Vic Fangio took the youngest defense in football and turned them into one of the greatest defenses in NFL history. The number one defense overall in 2024 that made Patrick Mahomes look like a chump. I mean, there's so many amazing stories, but an underrated one, and this is really kind of digging into the weeds, but I want to get into this because, as I mentioned, this Eagles roster was so flawless, and from top to bottom, I mean, you guys heard me talk about it the other day, and you saw the game. All the role players that stepped up all year long when their name was called, and even in the Super Bowl, all the role players that made big-time plays. This roster was so beautifully constructed. But there's one starter, at least, that doesn't get talked about enough, and I want to talk about his story because he really is what this Eagles team was all about. Like, he truly represents what made the 2024 Eagles so great. And you could actually say he was the worst starter of all 22 guys that played the majority of snaps this year. I want to talk about Johan Dotson, the Philadelphia Eagles' third-string wide receiver. I love the story of Dotson in 2024, how it started versus how it ended. Like, this was a former first-round pick from only a couple years ago that was a top 20 selection out of Penn State. Washington took him to be the 1A, 1B with Terry McLaurin. Like, it was supposed to be those two for the future in Washington. And then Dotson fell out of favor with the new coaching staff this year. The Eagles trade a third-round pick for him, and he just was not a part of the offense at all year long. And you could say why that was. Is it just the chemistry wasn't there with Jalen? Is it because of the target monsters in front of him, Devontae Smith, A.J. Brown, Dallas Goedert? Is it because the Eagles ran the ball more than anybody, and they're just the ball, it wasn't going around enough for everybody? Like, not everybody was going to be fed. I think is it Dotson was just struggling to get open? I think it's a combination of a lot of these things, but it resulted in Johan Dotson being one of the most least involved starters in the entire NFL this year. And again, this is a former first-round pick, a standout at Penn State that did make plays for 2 years in Washington. Like, yeah, this wasn't a 1,000-yard receiver in the NFC East, but he consistently, in both years as a full-time starter, made big-time plays, had over 500 receiving yards in both seasons with the Commanders. And he comes into Philly, and because of all these reasons, again, he's with stars in the passing game, 3 studs in front of him that the passing game runs through. Nick Sirianni says it all the time. And then, if Saquon Barkley's on this team and they run the football and throw the football less than anybody, they run more than anybody in the league. So Dotson's just not getting involved, and yet he was just such a team player all year. All he and this entire team, again, that's why I say, he truly represents who this Eagles team was in 2024. He truly just wanted to win. That's all that mattered. He put his head down, and every single game, it just felt like he's running clearing routes and just kind of a decoy out there. And that had to be really hard to go through all year. And it had to be hard for him to not be disengaged and when his number was called, maybe not step up. And yet, it's so cool that in the biggest moments, in the playoffs against Green Bay, in the Super Bowl against Kansas City, when Jalen Hurts did have to call his number, Dotson stepped up. He scored the first touchdown of the playoffs against Green Bay on that first drive in the back of the end zone. In the Super Bowl, the first quarter, Dotson made the first 2 big plays in the passing game. He had 2 catches for 42 yards, nearly scores a touchdown if his knee wasn't down, 2 explosive plays to really get the thing rolling. And to do that when you're never really involved for an entire year, for 20 games at this point? That is so impressive to me. It shows the selflessness of Dotson. It shows the engagement that he did have, that he was ready. And not a lot of Eagles in the past, when their number was called in these kind of situations, did step up. I said it on the podcast before the Super Bowl, that Quez Watkins' number was finally called in Super Bowl 52 or 57, a very similar situation to Dotson. Quez was just not targeted a lot in 2022, not like 2021, because Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown and Dallas Goedert, they got the football. And if it wasn't those 3, Jalen Hurts was running, or the ball was going to Miles Sanders or Kenneth Gainwell, Quez was just not involved in the offense. And then he had his number called in the Super Bowl, a go ball that he should have caught. There's your moment. And he dropped it. And I said, I believe Dotson's going to do it. I believe if his number is called in the Super Bowl, he's going to do it. I saw that Week 18 performance. I thought he was really good with Tanner McKee against the Giants. This is a former first-round pick that was a my guy for me a few years ago on this podcast. I saw him when his number was called against Jacksonville this year. Jalen Hurts throws him up just a prayer in double coverage. He's draped, the corner's draped all over Dotson. He jumps up and makes one of the coolest circus catches I've ever seen. Every time Dotson's number was called this year, he stepped up. And in the Super Bowl, for him to do that, 2 catches for 42 yards, 2 explosive plays through the air. When the game was, that was when the game was close. That's really cool. And it again shows, it's not just him, but again, Avonte Maddox putting his head down, being benched for Cooper DeJean. Then on 4th down, one-on-one with DeAndre Hopkins in the Super Bowl. In the second half, he makes the pass deflection to force the turnover. Dotson really is just one of a lot of guys that was always ready when their number was called and truly just did what the team needed to win football games, whether it hurt his, individual stats and status long-term or not. Again, this isn't just some random guy that was just happy to be on the field. Johan Dotson was a full-time starter in Washington. He was a former top 20 pick in the first round. And all year, he was just not involved in the offense at all. There is no, I don't want to say he was the worst starter with the Eagles because he wasn't really given a chance, but he was the least involved starter of all 22 by far. And you can make the argument of any starter in the entire NFL this year. Johan Dotson might have been one of the least involved players when it comes to actually getting the football. And yet he was always out there blocking. He was always out there making plays when Jalen Hurts did throw his way. And I just think that's a really, of all the stories of this Super Bowl win, and there's 1,000 of them, I think the Dotson story, when it comes to the underrated storylines of this year, that's a really cool one for me. Was it worth the trade? No. Obviously, I would rather have the Philadelphia Eagles have that 3rd-round pick than what they got from Dotson this year. But I don't know, at the same time, he made 2 huge plays in the Super Bowl. Did they absolutely need that to win the championship? No. I think Howie Roseman used to say with Golden Tate to justify that trade when he gave up a 3. Hey, I'll trade a 3rd-round pick for a playoff win every day because Golden Tate had the game-winning touchdown on fourth down in the double doink game against Chicago, right? So in a way, like, you kind of won the trade a little bit by Dotson making those 3 plays in the playoffs. I'd rather have the third-round pick, so in a vacuum, the trade was not good, considering what a small role he had. But at the same time, it worked out a lot better than it was looking during the year. The fact that he did make those plays in the postseason, in the Super Bowl, like, it helps out a lot. So, I mean, this trade didn't look good for a while, and for it to end the way it did, it's a really cool story. And he's young, and he's under contract still. And if next year the Philadelphia Eagles throw the ball more, if they become more of a balanced offense to keep Saquon Barkley healthier, even though he was healthy this year, it's not sustainable for him to have the workload he did this year again next year. So if they throw more next year, Dotson will likely have a bigger role. And now with Jalen Hurts having a year of chemistry built up with Dotson, and he knows Dotson can make big plays in big moments in the biggest games, if there are more injuries to Brown and Smith and Goddard like there were this year, I think you'll see Dotson more involved next year. I actually think, again, is it worth a third-round pick? No. But considering what he did this year when his number was called and the potential bigger role he could have next year, I think the story is yet to be written on this trade. Like, I wouldn't go off and say this trade was terrible yet. It's already looking better because of the playoffs, and I think next year could look even better. And I just think it's a really cool story of a selfless player that had a high pedigree in football in college and a first-round pick that made plays for Washington. And for him to do what he did this year and be a good soldier for the Eagles and then make plays when his number was called, I don't know. I like that a lot. I think it's a really cool, underrated story of the year. All right, guys, coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. When was the moment you knew this team was destined to win a championship? There was a moment for me in the playoffs where I just felt like this team's getting it done. I'm going to tell you what that moment was as we wrap up this Thursday edition of Locked On Eagles. This episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature. It keeps every moment of the game exciting. Whether I'm back in the 76ers, which is really tough right now. Paul George had a brutal game the other day. Or I'm picking one of my players to hit a clutch 3 like LeBron James. I never feel like I missed my chance. Plus, the app is super easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, when was the moment you knew the Eagles were going to win the Super Bowl? And I don't mean like what play in Super Bowl 59, because if that's the case, I think it was, I don't want to say it was the Cooper DeJean pick 6. That was when I started to feel a little more comfortable. Up by 3 scores, 17-0 with how dominant they looked. I thought to myself, okay, this could be different. This feels a little bit different than 2 years ago. The Devontae Smith dagger, the touchdown deep, that's when I knew it was over. They won a championship. But I mean more, like, when did you think this was the team that was going to get it done? Like, what moment this year did you say, no, this feels special? Like, this feels like destiny. This is going to happen. The moment for me was in the Blizzard game against the Los Angeles Rams. And I knew this team was special before that. Like the 10-game win streak, you knew this team was ready for the big games when they beat the Baltimore Ravens close, like Cooper DeJean body slamming Derrick Henry. That was a moment that showed us, hey, like the Eagles, they can beat the best of the best. They can be clutch late in these games on the road against the toughest team in football. Like that was a statement win to show you. Them throwing all over an elite Pittsburgh defense. That was another moment where you thought, okay, this team's special. That was the one shoe we finally needed, the last shoe to drop, was for the passing game to look good against a good team. They did that. Even the shootout earlier in the year with Joe Burrow, like that was a huge win for us to see Jalen Hurts outduel a star quarterback, and that was foreshadowing for what we saw in Super Bowl 59 against Patrick Mahomes. Like we needed to see a lot of these moments to feel like the Eagles could win a championship. But when Jalen Carter sacked Matt Stafford, That's when I knew this team was like, it was destiny that this team was going to win a championship. Because before that, Matt Stafford's driving down the field in the blizzard, and there's maybe 2 minutes left, not even. It felt like if Matt Stafford scored that touchdown, it's over. And I remember when Puka Nacua caught that big reception to put them inside the 20. I remember looking at my girlfriend watching the game together, and I'm like, this is it. Tears almost in my eyes, just out of pure devastation because of how much I loved the 2024 Eagles, and saying, it can't end this way, but I can't believe it's going to. Like, this is going to happen. Matt Stafford's going to get this done. It just looked like the Eagles were done. It just felt like it after the Jalen Hurts injury. And for Jalen Carter to make that play, I can't stop thinking about that play. When they won the Super Bowl and everyone around me in Center City in Philly is cheering and celebrating, and thinking about all the moments of that game, I couldn't help but keep thinking about the Blizzard game. I couldn't help but keep thinking about the Jalen Carter sack to set up a long third down and then a fourth down and completion to Puka Nacua. I mean, that play saved the season. For Carter to do that with their backs against the wall in a blizzard, I just said to myself, like, this is the moment when America's Game comes out on NFL Network, the Super Bowl documentary of the 2024 Philadelphia Eagles. What's going to be the peak moment that the producers of that doc highlight the most? It's going to be the blizzard game against the Rams. And maybe it's the moment where Saquon Barkley scores the touchdown and he's tapping on his head because he's so fired up that he thinks like that's the dagger. But no, it's going to be the moment right after where the game was not over and Jalen Carter had to decide it was over. Like, I really think that was the moment I said, this is the highlight moment of the season we're going to see for years to come. We'll remember this play for the rest of our lives. Like, it's going to happen. It's too perfect. It's too big of a moment in the playoffs, at home, in a blizzard. The best player on your defense that's trying to become the next Fletcher Cox, the next Aaron Donald. Like, this feels like destiny, and it just showed how big time this team was on both sides of the ball in huge moments, in clutch situations in the fourth quarter of a playoff game against a Super Bowl winning head coach and quarterback that have you on the ropes. When they did that, I said, there's nobody stopping this team. Like, they are built for this. And that's a young second-year player that made that play. And yeah, he's a generational talent, Jalen Carter, defensive tackle. Aaron Donald knows it. He said Carter is like next up. As who's the next him? He said it's Jalen Carter. That moment, and again, just the theatrics of it too, like the moment, the stage, the aesthetic of the snow, it all just felt like that. This can't now end without a championship. Like, it has to end in a Super Bowl, right? Like, this moment is scripted. It feels like it was a movie. That moment, that game just felt like it was a movie. And so for me, at least, that's when I knew they were winning a championship, is when Carter fell on Matt Stafford to set up the final play, and Darius Slay finishes it against Puka Nacua. So to me, I don't know what you guys think, but that was the moment I said they were winning a Super Bowl. And of course, the Super Bowl itself, what play did I finally relax and say, oh my gosh, they're champions? It's the Devontae Smith dagger. But before that, when did I think they were destined to do this? Like, when did I know the 2024 Eagles were different? They weren't the 2022 Eagles. They weren't the 2023 Eagles or the other teams in the past that just couldn't get it done. When did I think they were the 2017 Birds yet again, reincarnated? The Carter sack on Matt Stafford. What a moment. It's my favorite play of the year. It really is. I mean, there's so many awesome plays from the season. The backwards leap from Saquon against Jacksonville. Devontae Smith's one-handed touchdown in that game. Jalen Hurts' 40-yard touchdown run against L.A. All the Super Bowl plays. Cooper DeJean's pick six. The Saquon 60-yard rushing touchdown against Washington in the NFC title. The first play of the game for the Eagles on offense. The link erupts. Like, it felt like the Beastquake run, right? But to me, my favorite play, the Saquon run in the blizzard, the Jalen Carter sack, that was the play of the season. That's when I knew. All right, guys, that's going to do it for this Thursday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. Thanks, as always, for making us your first listen each and every day. One more show for you this week, and we continue to be your everydayers Monday through Friday, all throughout the offseason, because before you know it, the Combine's in 2 weeks. It's draft season. Pro days are coming up soon. Mock Draft Mondays will be back on the show. we got you covered right here on Locked On Eagles. Thanks as always for downloading, watching, and listening. And let's go, Birds. Fly, Eagles, fly.